We are live now. So, hi and welcome everyone. And thank you all for tuning in to the 18th session of the LUMS Live webcast. Our panel for today will be discussing the COVID-19 pandemic and its multifarious intersections with politics and democracy, with the state, and how that relates to how society is coping with the pandemic itself. This session is brought to you by the Office of Advancement in collaboration with the Mehboob Haq Research Center. Mehboob Haq Research Center is LUMS's flagship organ for interdisciplinary research in the social sciences. They're doing a whole range of research projects and obviously public outreach projects on issues related to inequality and issues related to governance and political economy. My name is Umair Javed. I teach politics and sociology at LUMS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome an all-star panel for our discussion today. So joining us today is Dr. Shandana Khan Mohmand, one of Pakistan's leading social scientists and development researchers. Dr. Mohmand is a fellow and lead of the governance team at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex, and an associate fellow at the Institute of Development and Economic Alternatives here in Pakistan. Her fantastic monograph, Crafty Oligarchs, Savvy Voters, Democracy Under Inequality in Rural Pakistan, was published last year by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Mohmand has worked extensively on issues of social and political development, not just in Pakistan, but across countries in the global south. Next up, we have Dr. Sameen Mohsin Ali, who is an assistant professor of politics at LUMS. Dr. Ali completed her PhD in politics from SOAS, University of London, in 2018. Her teaching and research interests include comparative politics, bureaucratic and party politics, and public health governance, with a particular focus on immunization. So that's particularly relevant to the context that we find ourselves in today. Also joining us is Mr. Ammar Rashid, who is a development professional and an academic by profession, and an activist who has been a leading member of the Awami Workers' Party since its founding in 2012. He is currently a senior researcher at the public health think tank Heartfile. He has a BSc in economics from LUMS and a master's degree in development studies from the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex University. Ammar has worked on a wide range of public policy and social development related issues, including subnational governance, gender and development, as well as public health and education reform. And our fourth and final participant today is Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar. Aasim is Associate Professor of Political Economy at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies, Quaid-i-Azam University. He works on diverse subjects such as state theory, informality, colonial history, and social movements. He is the author of 3 books, most recently, The Politics of Common Sense, State, Society, and Culture in Pakistan, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. Alongside his academic pursuits, Aasim has also been closely affiliated with progressive political and social movements in Pakistan for more than 2 decades. Thank you once again to everyone on the panel for making time to join us. We have a significant array of potential sub-themes to talk about. Questions such as how is politics shaping people's experience of the pandemic? What are the COVID-related implications of people having differing access to the state and to political resources? What role does democratic politics have, if any, in the way that states and societies respond to such large-scale disruptions? Unfortunately, though, we only have an hour to bring it all together. So keeping that in mind, I'll exercise my moderator's prerogative and go around the panel with 2 rounds of questions for each panelist. And then we'll conclude the discussion by bringing in thoughts and comments from viewers and listeners to the webcast, who can use the Facebook comment section to ask questions. You can also email us questions at ask@lums.edu.pk. That's ask@lums.edu.pk. Just a small request to our panelists, and the request is to basically keep your primary responses to under 5 minutes, but please feel free to add or respond to what others are also saying. So with these formalities out of the way, let's just get straight into our discussion. I'll start off with Dr. Shandana, and obviously who can draw on her extensive experience of looking at political and social development issues across the global south, to help us situate the discussion within a more macro sort of political economy framework. And I guess the question that really I think will help us sort of kickstart this discussion is what how can we explain sort of variation in both responses and outcomes to the pandemic, across the global south, across different countries across the world. Do you think sort of broad categories such as type of regime, for example, do you think, or nature of government, do you think those are particularly useful in helping us make sense of what's happening? Or do we need to tunnel a bit more to get to sort of the political determinants of not just the variation that we see, but also the long-term governing implications, the governance implications in particular of what we see that emerges from this particular pandemic? So Shandana, your thoughts on that, please.
Thank you for the invite, Umair, and for convening this. It's really great to get a chance to be able to speak to some of these. And the question that you've asked, I think the answer very simply is yes, there's lots of implications of this, and there are real determinants, governance-related determinants of variation that we see. The answer is can be quite complex, but we've come under, obviously, there's been more and more demand to try and simplify this to the basic things that really matter at a time like this, and what are the sorts of responses that are going to matter the most. So I'll try and just focus on those and try and keep it as simple and foundational as possible, in the sense of what we think might really matter. And we've been doing quite a bit of research around this, trying to reduce it to those few basics. One very foundational fact, I think, that now needs to be accepted is that we might need to reduce the demarcation or the boundaries that we draw between the global north and the global south. I think one of the things that's become very clear is that there is great fragility around the world, and fragility was always associated with a particular set of countries. And we've seen a real fragility across what you might call the global north as well, in North America, across Europe. We've seen what the sorts of fragility in state-citizen relationships that has become very obvious because of this pandemic. So this idea of sort of fragility being about regime types is true, but it's a more complex idea than simply about being a democratic regime or an authoritarian regime. It's really come down to us thinking more deeply about state-citizen linkages and what those are determined by. And I think fragility is a word that you can use for right here in the UK, where I sit right now. We're talking about fragility of the relationship between states and citizens. At a very basic level, it makes a real difference, because it's about something as simple as, do people believe what the government has to say? And in a pandemic, that becomes a really major issue. When the government stays home, do people stay home? When the government says come out, do people believe that? There are sort of news coming out of various countries of the fact that there's groups of people that will accept what the government has to say, and then there's other groups who believe that it doesn't even exist actually, or that it's some kind of a conspiracy theory. And it's so much of this comes down to to whether you're willing to believe what the state has to say to you anymore. And so much of that is raising now questions of legitimacy and of transparency, but a very basic concept of trust, and trust in your institutions, and trust across different community, different social groups, different types of groups that live in a country, and whether you trust messages that are coming out of that based on who's in power or not. The pandemic has been a particular kind of governance challenge, and there's a few reasons for why this has been such a challenge. It has raised the need for more revenue. The government needs more money to be able to deal with this crisis, to be able to recover from it, and to be able to make sure that people are not badly affected by it. But it has had to raise revenue without increasing taxes, for example, because there's arguments that have been made about the fact that this is a time to reduce taxes to make sure that the economy continues unaffected, and so that people are not affected badly. So you're making arguments for more money at a time when you're saying don't raise more money, not from the population at least. It is a time of a challenge because the government has to do more but at a time when its frontline staff is particularly affected or reduced in many ways. And it's a time when the government has had to raise money while dealing with the fact that there's greater polarization in society and greater fragility, and therefore good parts of the country that don't want to engage with the state in a greater sense than before. So this is not a time within sort of the polarization that we were already talking about. This is not a time when people are sort of going to come forward and say, let's just help our let's give more. So it's created a real issue of states being in a position where they need money, but not being in a position where they know how to raise this, or to raise this without increasing the polarization within society. And the sorts of variation that you then might see between the global north or the global south, or even across the global south or across within the countries of the global north, is going to be based around these issues of trust and legitimacy and accountable representation, and where people believe that they are actually represented by the state and therefore are wanting to engage in ways that are different from where people might not even believe what the government has to say about this, or the ways in which it might want to be able to sort of raise more money or deliver services in a particular way. A major challenge where we think governments might make a major mistake is that in raising revenue, they might go to those that are already under a lot of stress, or those that were already compliant in terms of tax terms, and not use this as a critical juncture at which a point at which you start progressive taxation, for example. So for the longest time, the richest groups around the world have managed to use one law after another or one loophole after another to not pay taxes. And this is, and therefore severely constrain government's abilities to deal with these moments of reduced state capacity in any case. And by state capacity, we mean so many different things. At a very basic level, it's obviously staff. It's an ability to reach your vulnerable populations across the entire country. It's being able to use your systems of governance to be able to make sure that you're reaching every part of your country, but actually have most vulnerable and marginalized populations on your lists. And one of the biggest issues we have in countries like Pakistan, especially, and we've suffered under this in doing research for a very long time, is two very specific problems. One is the lack of data. We actually don't know who lives where and who's been affected and to what extent. Every time we start a new research project, we sit down with multiple maps drawn by different units of government who are all using different demarcations and have the hardest time just being able to lay out information on top of one another to have it make sense. It's an issue of technology as well, but then it's an issue of trained staff in these areas. And we rarely have people who are trained for particular situations like this. And at that point, then you sort of have this notion of accountable governance, which is are those people in power there for reasons of serving the needs of the population, or are they there because of other political economy considerations, such as extending the power of certain institutions? So there's been, I'll stop there for not going much further, but a lot of it comes down to these two notions of money and states needing to have more in order to be able to meet the needs of its most marginalized and vulnerable populations at a time like this, but not having the data or the state capacity in terms of the right expertise, another aspect of it is the incentives. And do they have the incentives in terms of representing the people who might need the most? And that, I think, are going to be those three things, I think, is going to determine the differences we'll see in the recovery across the different countries. Let's leave it there for now.
Right. Thanks, Shandana. I think those are some really interesting points, and I think it really contextualizes the discussion well for us and sort of moving forward. I think that's these two aspects. One is, which is obviously a resource-based sort of characteristics of various states in terms of what kind of resources they have to respond to it and where can they draw those resources from. But also these other issues, or these interconnected issues of state capacity, expertise, the ability to have the right incentives and accountability, but also questions of trust and legitimacy, which are so intrinsic to shaping social responses to how you deal with the pandemic. And I want to bring in Dr. Sameen here because Sameen's work on public health immunization programs in Pakistan, I think, is very useful from obviously is very useful from a both policy perspective as well as a research perspective. But so Sameen, building on Shandana's point about state capacity, and obviously given your past research on public health campaigns, especially the polio campaign, I think there are multiple aspects of questions of trust, legitimacy, and capacity that tend to intermingle as far as sort of Pakistan's existing governance infrastructure, so to speak, is concerned, right? So, what do you think have been these sort of what are some of the more useful aspects of the existing infrastructure that we have, or what do you think have been sort of ways in which the existing infrastructure is actually limited the way that public health interventions are being implemented, or are failing or fledgling, as the case may be, for Pakistan?
Thank you, Umair. I think I'm going to pick up on very similar themes to the ones that Shandana mentioned. So our work, let me start with the useful things that that are working actually in immunization. So for instance, you have very, very committed fieldwork staff, right? So frontline staff is very committed to the cause of whether it's immunization or lady health workers or vaccinators or whoever it is. They do their job in very difficult circumstances, and that has to be acknowledged. They also do it with very limited resources, right? So they're often having to pay, for example, for their own fuel costs. They also do their work in the absence of, as Shandana pointed out, accurate data. So even for something like a vaccination program, the district level supervisors do not have accurate UC maps that reflect current levels of population. So how can you then plan for vaccination for any number of people when you don't know what the population is in your UC? There's also things like staff shortages, problems like storage issues. For instance, you need to keep vaccines maintained through a cold chain, right? So you need to keep them at a certain temperature. When you don't have regular electricity, when you don't have enough diesel, how do you ensure that the vaccine is being kept at the temperature that is required? These are all problems that hit even in districts like Kasur, which is, this is where we did our field work. This is a comparatively well-off, developed district right next to Lahore. And these are problems that exist even in areas like this. So, let alone Balochistan or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa or the former FATA regions. In terms of where the problem arises, so there's a couple of things that we can think about. The first is obviously bureaucratic response, and how can you improve that response in terms of things like training, data, etc. So those are obviously areas of focus, even for the government. To be fair, they are thinking about these things. It's not that they don't have any data. It's just that they have the data in forms that might not be very useful in terms of analytics, or it's not available to the public. So you can't have expertise from, for example, the private sector or universities necessarily getting involved in this work. So you have to basically push very hard to access some of that data. The other thing is that, and I said this when I did one of these sessions previously, public health is something that needs to be dealt with at least two levels, if not more. One, you need to have some kind of centralized response that is relatively uniform, right? So you need the federal government to have some messaging that says, oh, this is a disease that is difficult and problematic and dangerous, and this is, basic standards that need to be met in the care of patients and to prevent the disease. Then you need to have some kind of decentralized response. And to have a decentralized response, you actually have to have structures at that level, right? Whether it's a district level, provincial level, whatever, community level. For that, you need local governments, you need political party structures, and those are historically weak in Pakistan for an endless number of reasons. And those reasons, what they contribute to as well is a distrust of these structures amongst our bureaucracy. So the bureaucracy does not trust local government representatives to do anything that might help them. They don't trust political party structures to help them. And this sort of cycle of distrust and sort of not wanting to rely on others, not wanting to rely on political players, for example, causes very serious problems in terms of implementation, because the bureaucracy alone cannot do all of this. It needs partners. And if you don't trust your partners, you can't reach some of these communities. The other thing that I found interesting, particularly in reading about, for example, bureaucracy in China, this is Yuan Ang's work, is that the way that our bureaucracy is structured, it's not just that they don't have adequate training or data and maps and so on. It's also that we don't give them the space to innovate at a local level. So they don't have the ability to say to their higher ups that, look, in my area, I need these kinds of policies because this is what the population looks like. This is what the disease spread looks like in my area. So it might not work in so-and-so district, but it's going to work in my district. So those kinds of flexibilities, innovations, the ability to make those kinds of decisions is not something that we entrust to our local level, street level, or district level bureaucrat. And if you're not going to do that, then public health interventions have to be contextualized. And so at some level, you need to place some trust in some local players, in addition to whatever messaging you're doing at some centralized level. So what has happened for Pakistan is that you not only have very confused messaging from the top, you also have absolutely nobody who's able to make any kinds of local level decisions and look at what the disease spread is looking like at the local level. So there's, initiatives like, for example, the Punjab government is doing things like test and trace using phone technology. You also have, I think they've recently released an app that says, oh, we have so many beds and so many ventilators. But at the same time, you also have panicked patients saying there's no beds, there's no ventilators, nothing available. So how do you reconcile those two things? It's possible that data is not traveling fast enough. It's possible that there are other spoilers at the local level that are not being taken into consideration at the provincial or federal level. So and the reaction of the federal or provincial government should not be, oh, everyone is lying. That cannot be your reaction, because it's possible that you are unaware of whatever is going on the ground. So all of these sort of factors in terms of the historic centralization of power in Pakistan have very serious consequences in this particular circumstance because of the nature of the problem. So it's not that, we didn't have problems before. We've always had issues that could have been dealt with, better decentralization, better training, better data, et cetera, et cetera. It's just that the nature of the pandemic is such that it's bringing forth all of these issues with a renewed sort of vigor. And just to make a final point and to loop back on this point about trust, your population is only going to trust you if you're there as a state and as a service provider when they need you. If you are only there to, for example, vaccinate them for polio, or if you're only there to demand taxes, the state is not going to the citizen is not going to like you very much. And so what we found when we were doing our immunization research was that people would say to us that, oh, you're here to collect data so that the government can tax me on the number of children that I have. I don't trust the vaccine that the government is giving me. There's, in so and so place I heard that someone died because of the vaccine. Then it was on the TV that there are all these fake medicines in Pakistan. How do I know that this vaccine is actually legitimate and the real deal? So all of these concerns are to do with state capacity, are to do with service delivery. And until you address that basic distrust that the citizen has of the state and has of its bureaucracy, I don't think we can deal with these kinds of problems very effectively. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Sameen. That really sort of, I think, helps us bring the discussion and sort of grounds it in the Pakistani context. I want to turn to Ammar now. And I think, Ammar, there are two strands in the discussion that we've had so far, which dovetail really well with your experience both as an activist and a researcher. And the first is, let's make this transition in our conversation from governance to politics, right? So let's look at, Shandana actually very helpfully pointed out what the incentive structures, or hinted at what incentive structures might play, what role they might play in the way that responses are shaped. Similarly, Sameen's point about state trust and legitimacy being sort of a prolonged relationship. It can't just be sort of willed into existence at the moment of a pandemic. These point to some more structural determinants of the state-society relationship, which I think are linked to the political sphere in particular and the political dispensation that we find ourselves in. So I want to hear your thoughts on what you think, how the political dispensation in Pakistan has actually shaped our response, what have been some of the sort of limiting factors, and where are some of the sort of opportunities that might exist for obviously for improving the response that we've seen to date.
Yeah, thanks, Umair. I think where Sameen left out is a really good point to start off from. In terms of the political economy, I think what we have in Pakistan, similar to many other like post-colonial developing countries, is like a particular form of sort of clientelism that sort of is the governing logic of state and society, in which decisions are made and the state has a particular kind of a relationship with various competing groups in society, and in which is always trying to basically offset the interests of those particular groups and maintain like its sort of dominant position within society. And we've seen that sort of a continuation of that sort of dynamic in how the state has responded to the pandemic. And I think what it's been complicated by, and I think this is a characteristic that is like now being emerging like globally, that the states that have responded sort of worst, like the worst state responses to the pandemic have been in states which are governed by different forms of populism, by different kinds of political formations that can be loosely characterized as populist. And this is something like I studied as well when I was doing my master's. I did my dissertation on the PTI. And populism essentially, basically, it's a kind of political logic that seeks to sort of, that emerges from a set of sort of representative failures in the existing sort of order, democratic order, and creates this like sort of divide between the people, like in this amorphous mass of the people, and like an institutional other, and then frames its entire sort of political existence around that. And I think what we've seen is that in Pakistan, the populist formation that is the PTI, similar to other sort of formations like the Trump coalition in the United States, like Boris Johnson in the UK, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, has sort of has not adapted its populist logic to the gravity of the crisis before us. So for PTI, for instance, the fundamental political logic of its entire existence is anti-corruption. And this idea that there's a corrupt political elite, which is the fundamental contradiction, the principal contradiction in the society that is governing, and all other problems sort of revolve around that. And this sort of logic has continued to govern its operations throughout this pandemic. So, for instance, you've seen how we've seen like an acceleration of sort of NAP cases during the pandemic. We've seen targeting of opposition leaders. We've seen the targeting of the media, arrests of senior media figures during the outbreak, and the sort of even like a discourse emerging around like the corruption virus is worse than the coronavirus. And I think that's really sort of hindered the response. And I think one of the reasons is there's a fundamental sort of anti-politics character to populism, which doesn't really see governing as a sort of political sort of act in terms of like seeing it as a collection of different social groups which might need to cooperate at some level to address crises of this nature. And instead, it's continued to see itself as sort of pitted against this institutional other, whether it's other political parties, whether it's like the educated elite, this constant discourse of like how public health measures are simply an elite demand. And that's, I think, gravely impacted the crisis. I think the tendency of populism to sort of fall into like this cult-like hero worship of the populist leader has also been like immensely sort of damaging, in which multiple missteps are continually defended in and out by supporters of PTI, by supporters in the press, and regardless of what the evidence is telling us. Then I think there's also the fact that there's an anti-science element to a lot of populist discourse, in which the demands of the sort of populist coalition tend to outweigh any consideration of science and evidence. I think we've seen that repeatedly, in which the governing coalition, the ruling parties, a tendency has been to base its decisions on which elements of its populist coalition, whether it's traders, whether it's the religious clergy, whether it's the military, whether it's whichever backers of its population coalition there are, their demands have to be satisfied, rather than any sort of attention to the research and evidence on how the pandemic has to be responded to. We've seen them actively sort of attack expertise, which is again another feature of populist movements the world over, a suspicion of science and expertise. Like for instance, how we saw the Punjab government actively sort of undermining its own health departments sort of report on the spread of the virus. Then the federal government attacking the same report, the federal health state minister for health also saying that the report was more guided by biases and ideology rather than evidence. So I think it's a combination of all of these different things, a lack of attention to science, a suspicion of science, a continued adherence to the sort of anti-corruption mode of politics that population has, the reliance on cult worship and hero worship of the populist leader, that I think, whether it's you're talking about Pakistan, the US, the UK, Brazil, or multiple other countries, I think that's really sort of hobbled the pandemic response in Pakistan. And unless I think there's some kind of arresting of this dynamic, unless there's some greater attention paid to science, until there is some sort of attention paid to political cooperation across partisan lines, then I think we're going to see the situation continue to deteriorate, whether you're talking about Pakistan or other countries governed by similar political logics around the world.
Right. Thanks, Ammar. I think that's that's an interesting way of framing it, and obviously, I think that really brings in the importance of politics to this entire aspect. I think हमने अभी तक जितनी भी बात की है उसके अंदर हम हमें दो बहुत important stands जो हैं वो नजर आ रही हैं. एक obviously ये है कि there are straight up questions of about capacity and tech expertise, but also questions that are related to which are less tangible issues such as legitimacy and trust that people exercise in the state itself. And I think, so I want to sort of now turn to Aasim here and sort of carry on the discussion from where Ammar left it off, which is on this issue of sort of, a resurgent populism and how, and the implications that has for large-scale disruptions such as those posed by a pandemic. And Aasim, I really appreciate अगर हम एक historical perspective इस discussion में ले आएं कि obviously हर pandemic जो है वो different होता है, उसकी अपनी एक sort of nature होती है, it has its own sort of realities, but are there parallels in political and social history that we can think of which can help us make sense of the way that how states are responding to the pandemic, and more importantly how these issues of resurgent nationalism, populism, and even authoritarianism, as we see in several countries across the global north and the global south, or how these sort of interact with such disruptions. And I'm wondering if you can sort of shed light on this from a more historical perspective.
Thanks, Umair. Yes, I can. And, I think it starts and ends with sort of, in some ways, it feels like the discussion has gone from local all the way, and we're extrapolating up into some kind of macro story. And I think that's appropriate because this pandemic in Pakistan and the world is basically showing up some systemic logics, right? One is they're expressed in a particular political idiom or an anti-politics idiom, like Ammar has described. The structural logics are global, and I think that's sort of the shock to the system that was created, was precisely because circuits of capital stopped moving, because everything shut down, and everything that's happened relates to that. Not everything, but there's so many parts of the story that relate to these sorts of questions: resources, capacity. A lot of these have to do with historical logics. The obvious parallel is actually the interwar years, between the end of the First World War and the Second World War, when capitalism, as all sort of major political economic sort of forecasts have suggested, this is going to be the biggest single political, economic. Now you add to it, which didn't exist 90 years ago, ecological crisis in at least 100 years. And what did that produce? It produced a series of, as Ammar has described, a series of basically scarecrow regimes that blamed the proverbial other for underlying systemic failures, which of course they were not willing to name. Just if you take the obvious example of Pakistan, and all three of my co-speakers have hinted at different elements of what's going on in Pakistan. It's interesting to me, at least it feels like there's a big elephant in the room which doesn't even get criticism. The regime that we are observing in front of us is being criticized, but there's an entire apparatus that continues to suck up a lot of money and is simply not named. And I think that's what we're seeing around the world. When the pandemic first erupted, was a naming of these systemic logics. There was a naming of how sort of circuits of capital would rather privilege profit rather than stop flow of the virus. That's where it started when it emerged in China. Then we had the ongoing scandal of enough personal protection equipment in countries which have atom bombs. These are all underlying systemic logics, and what history is telling us now, in fact, I think what we have to sort of come to terms with is that history said there were massive crises, and in the absence of explicit consenting forms of politics in which people were mobilized, classes in particular, but also poor countries and in general sort of the wretched of the earth, to challenge these systemic logics. In the absence of that, you get an exacerbation of these hate-based, hate-mongering forms of politics. And I think it's important to bear in mind that what we see in the form of a PTI or in the form of Modi next door, Trump, these are not, this is that the pandemic has simply shown up what already existed. And these crises of mass representation, which Ammar hinted at, speak to some fundamental, there's an impossibility within the established crises of representation, primarily to do with money and the mass media and how the mass media operates, to challenge these and even name these systemic logics, right? Actually, you have to name it, you have to develop a broad-based consensus over it. But as Ammar says, if you get shot down and in typically Pakistani fashion, that you are an anti-state conspirator, then there's no question that you even get to the heart of the matter. So there is some very deep system. But the question of history, I think, is important for one reason also, which is that, 90 years ago when the Great Depression happened, most of the world was colonized. And we were talking about the Western world, so to speak, or what these days we call the global North, right? Now it's different, right? Now the vast majority of countries are nominally, at least, run through some kind of representative democracy, and that sort of gives rise, ironically, I think, somewhat counterintuitively, to a logic of completely shutting down and looking inwards and becoming insular. And I think this also speaks to, I don't know if we'll have time, this also speaks to the failures of neoliberal globalization, right? Like the fact that this populist wave emerges, at least in the Western world, first in response to the great financial crisis of about 10, 12 years ago. There was an element, there was a period in which things were being named, and then there was no countervailing sort of political force that could step into the vacuum, and then you got a Trump and a Bojo and a Bolsonaro and Modi in India and so on and so forth. And this pandemic is just simply going to reinforce those underlying systemic crises. And if they're not named, and I think part of that includes, as you're suggesting, placing them into some kind of historical context and recognizing this is like a burgeoning crisis that is blowing out of proportion. I think ecology is a big part of the story, and I think most of your listeners will know that this virus starts in large part because of practices of industrial farming and large-scale animal farming, which continue to be, again, largely unnamed after the first little while. So these are, I think, all of the other questions that I've heard people raise, like questions of trust, legitimacy, resources. None of this, for me, gets addressed unless we talk about, this sort of the elephant in the room. That can be a particular political entity or force. Let's say in Pakistan, the security establishment, which makes decisions and takes resources and develops a whole imaginary of how society should be run. It can be sort of more broadly the logics of production and exchange, which are based on profiteering logics. So I think that this inevitably require some sort of recourse to history to think through these questions. But I think the bigger and probably more daunting challenge is an actual sort of political, at least as Ammar is saying, at least some forms of political coalitions that are both willing to take on sort of these big lobbies and have the capacity to generate some kind of genuine support. Because I think what ends up happening in situations like this, people are so obviously divided, fragmented, panicked, that's why these populists win, right? Because it's easy to say, oh, Modi can say, oh, it's a corona jihad, right? And Imran Khan can say, oh, this is all because or he can actually, as we've seen, he can actually pitch himself as the defender of the poor, as opposed to his predecessors who apparently pillaged the country unlike himself. So I think that this is inevitably, we have to think through history and think through not just more distant history, but more recent history. And that will help us think through at least what the nature of the problem is, if not come up with an easy solution to how to address it.
Right. Thanks, Aasim. I think that, really this question of history and how history sort of, how we can learn from it, and also how it relates to how it helps us think about these issues in a sort of more global perspective. I think that's a very useful way of framing the issue. Unfortunately, we're a bit short on time, and I think there are a number of things that we can still pass through. I want to actually turn back to Shandana. Because I think there is when we speak about politics and we speak about political inequality and issues of representation, I think a lot of our conversations so far have sort of largely focused on issues of how the pandemic has been dealt with from a governance or a technocratic perspective. But I'm also interested in sort of looking at how people themselves are responding to the pandemic, and what are some of the possible resources that they can draw on, or what are some of the areas in which they will be limited by existing patterns of political participation. So I think in particular, what I'd be interested to know is how, Shandana, how you think patterns of political inequality, based on your work on obviously rural Punjab, how you think that those act as factors or variables that determine the way that the state might respond to the pandemic, or how people themselves might actually respond to the situation that we find themselves in.
It's a difficult question to answer, because so many different configurations sort of affect how people would behave under that. And what my book was obviously set at a very different time, talking about rural inequality at that time. But essentially what was coming out of that is the fact that most of these responses are quite strategic on everyone's part. And what's always interested me is that, we're talking about populism, and we're talking about governments and these agencies that are unaccountable and not unrepresentative of what people need. But the fact that all of them are essentially elected institutions, have come to power through elections, and this is a very different kind of authoritarianism that we're now seeing, takes a lot of the focus to voters and what they're responding to and why they're voting for these kinds of regimes. So yes, there is a big sort of gap of trust and legitimacy between states and citizens, but they are electing these governments, which means that there's certain messages that are going through. And one way of explaining that is clientelism, and the fact that it's all patronage, and it happens because of a very different logic and not the sorts of ideas that we're talking about here. But at the same time, what I was trying to sort of establish in my book is that it's strategic to the extent also of politics and some kind of identification, and trying to look for political space being part of the strategy of a voter, and that there is a natural move away from power and the sort of forces that sort of repress or seek to repress. If that space is allowed to them. And that's where a lot of the logic from the top down comes in, is that space is deliberately restricted for all kinds of reasons, but that there is a real tension going on between voters wanting more space and looking for more space wherever they can find it, and obviously those in power not allowing it. How that affects the pandemic, I think, is a very complex question, because it sits beyond this. To me, it comes back again to this idea of trust again, and the extent to which they can depend on the state. But the areas where you're talking about, I think Sameen spoke to that very directly in saying the state is quite absent in those places, right? So what you have is these networks that sit outside the state, but that the state is largely absent. And one thing that the state has done in Pakistan is to also break its linkages with non-state actors, civil society actors, activists, all kinds of other networks, research institutions that could have come together at a time like this and provided solutions, or just helped in sort of changing the narrative to the extent where I've heard from colleagues recently that people are refusing tests, that there's a high rate of rejection of the test going on. That speaks very deeply to this deficit of of trust. And at a time when you could have been using all of your networks and bringing in researchers and bringing in mobilizers and bringing in civil society actors, the Pakistani state has worked over the last decade at least to seriously isolate itself from these networks. So I'll leave it at that for now. Yeah.
Thanks, Shandana. I think these are, again, very important sort of points, because really we seem to be sort of now percolating down to this issue of again, state presence, state trust, and sort of to link it back to what Ammar and Aasim both suggested, is that crises of representation or crises of politics essentially are crises that can then have manifest responses, manifest sort of outcomes depending on the kind of disruption that we see. So what we count as peacetime, these problems might not seem as apparent, but when you have a large scale disruption such as a pandemic, these underlying structural constraints become really sort of obvious. And these constraints, as Aasim said, are historical in nature. They're not locally situated. They're sort of global currents that are tied to, again, things like how capitalism works, how states and politics obviously interact with capitalism. But to sort of again, to sort of bring it back to and this is it's actually good because we go back to Sameen, who actually brought this out the most forcefully in her earlier statement. So we know that we have these structural constraints on capacity, on trust, and legitimacy. What do you think is possible? But we're also operating in particularly tight time frames, right? And we again, even if there's no easy solution, surely there has to be something that the state can do. So given what we know from past experiences of successful ways in which even constrained states like Pakistan have responded to to different disruptions, what do you think can be done in the time frame that we're looking at, and given the constraints on trust, legitimacy, and capacity that we're working with?
I think messaging is one of the key things, right? So any public health intervention depends on communication, clear lines of communication. So if you're constantly contradicting yourself and your own SOPs and you're not following them visibly, then it's unlikely that your population is going to believe anything that you have to say in terms of asking them to do anything, right? So if you're not wearing a mask yourself, why should anyone else do it? If you keep saying it's the flu, it's not dangerous, it's not going to affect anyone beyond a certain age, then people are obviously going to then say that, okay, fine, then we can also relax. The other thing is that you have to keep in mind the population that you're providing information to. So it's not enough to simply say, well, follow the SOPs, right? What exactly do you want and why do you want it? So this is important for things like vaccinations as well, right? So you can go and say to people that you should get vaccinated, but if people don't understand what a vaccination is, how it works, and what it does to you, there are chances are they're going to say, well, why should we bother? My child is not sick. So why should I get them, medicated when there's no visible symptom? And so the coronavirus problem is similar, right? So if you're not sick, if there's no symptom that you don't have a cold or you don't have a fever, why should you take precautions when you're not sick? So, and this has to do with the way that we think about health in this country in general, right? So if you speak to any public health expert there or any doctor, the attitude that people have in this country is that, well, when we get sick, we'll go to the doctor. So prevention is not something that people tend to think about here. So you have to convince them that prevention is something that needs to be paid attention to. And this is the case for a number of diseases, but at this particular moment, this messaging is crucial, that to not get sick, to not get to the point where you need the ventilator, you have to take preventive action. And you have to then come up with ways for life to proceed even when those preventive measures are in place. Yes, we understand that, people will have lost their jobs, people will be struggling to make ends meet. And we also understand that we have an economy that is in crisis, but that does not mean that you simply lift your foot off the pedal and say that, well, I can't do anything about it. You have to put in place the measures that are needed to support the population that needs it the most. And you have to come up with ways, you have to think through and make some really difficult decisions about how you can support these populations while respecting the SOPs that you intend to put in place. At the same time, you cannot keep dismissing experts who might be questioning you or who might be asking for more data as, nefarious beings who have some ulterior motive. The whole point of having experts on board is that they give you certain pieces of advice based on their knowledge. And the expectation then is that you at least listen to some of what they have to say. You can't then say, well, we don't trust in this report, or we don't believe this report, or we're going to bury this report, right? And which is, one of the criticisms that we had for the Punjab government. And it's not that there's any lack of expertise. Punjab's health minister is herself a doctor. She knows all of this. So it's not rocket science that we're thinking about here. There are ways of handling this, but you have to think really clearly and communicate even more clearly with all populations, right? Not just people who are on Twitter, not just people who are watching, webinars like this, but everybody. So I'll stop here.
Right. Thanks, Sameen. I think Ammar, I think we're a bit short on time, so I have to apologize to Aasim that I might not be able to come back to him for his second question. But Ammar, I want to sort of get your thoughts on something that one of our listeners, viewers actually, Khuzaima Fatma Haq has mentioned. She's asked a question, which is, in your opinion, what would be an ideal balance between citizens' participation and government intervention to help curb the pandemic crisis? And I want to situate this within the broader discourse that we're seeing around Corona in Pakistan, which is that there are sort of frequent refrains to जी कि कौम जो है उसको समझाया जाता है लेकिन वो कुछ कर नहीं सकती, कौम जो है वो जाहिल है, या फिर इधर लिटरेसी इतनी लो है कि लोग SOPs फॉलो नहीं करते, लोग जो है वो WhatsApp फॉरवर्ड्स पे बिलीव करते हैं. And I think this again goes back to this fundamental question of trust in state authority. But at the same time, we also have, from Shandana's work and from her perspective, we also have large parts of the population that have no substantive relationship with the state in the first place, right? So that really then, so that puts us in a bit of a dilemma. Ek taraf you were asking about citizen participation and citizens becoming more responsible citizens as far as catering to the response and the pandemic is concerned. And at the other time, you're also asking the state to cultivate that trust possibly in locations where it has no pre-existing relationship, so to speak, to build on, and where it has no political basis, so to speak, to actually build on. So what do you think, given this dilemma, what do you think is sort of the balance, or what do you think is citizen responsibility, even if that is such a thing that we can conceive of as a response to this pandemic?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and one of the key questions of our time. And I think it centers around, I think, the role of the state. I think this pandemic has been, I think it's been like a defining moment in terms of how we look at the state. It's like the best argument made for the state as a provider of services and as a regulator of society since the neoliberal age began. And I think this is something that we have to take very seriously now and envision what kind of a state is necessary at this point in time. And like I said, when Aasim was talking about looking at things historically, I think it's also important to bear in mind, and it ties in with what Sameen is saying as well, that we have been through a period of several decades when the capacity of the state has been willfully emaciated, and its ability, its capacity to deliver services and have a functional relationship with its citizens has been absolutely undermined by by the defining market logics of our time. And like in Pakistan's case, several successive sort of structural adjustment programs which have sort of limited the role of the state, the service delivery particularly role of the state even further, which is why it finds it so difficult in times of a pandemic to get states to listen to it, to get states to follow instructions and take public health advice seriously. So in terms of the balance that needs to be struck, obviously in the short term, it's absolutely critical, the idea that there needs to be behavioral change, that citizens need to change how it is that they're acting in their everyday lives, and that involves communication, proper behavioral change communication strategy. That cannot obviously just be limited to ads on TVs. This is if you look at the examples from East Asian states and how countries like Vietnam, Thailand, and others have done it, these are community-based strategies. These are basically going into communities at the grassroots and explaining to them in very accessible language, in local idioms, what the point of all of these measures are and how they can sort of help mitigate the risk. So that needs to be done. It's been 3 months and we have had no behavioral change communication from the government, which is quite catastrophic, to be honest. It points to the non-seriousness of those in charge. But that can only go so far. That can go to an extent whereby citizens do in their everyday lives try to mitigate some of the risks. But at the same time, a lot of the reason that the risks exist in the first place are material reasons, which cannot be just wished away or changed simply by people changing how they're interacting in everyday lives. This will require a massive, a complete reorganization of the functions of the state, especially in Pakistan, in terms of how we envision it. It will have to involve a re-envisioning of the national security vision of the state that we have in Pakistan. It will have to involve massive levels of government intervention in key areas of the state that have been neglected for a very long time, whether it's public health, whether it's things like social protection, particularly cash transfers. We will have to sort of divorce to an extent people's ability to earn a living from their sort of from their ability to make their basic ends meet. So there will need to be a widespread sort of greater state intervention in basic income support kind of programs. We'll need to see greater intervention in housing, in how we regulate and regularize informal settlements. We've actually seen like evictions happen during the durations of the lockdown in this country, and similarly for other forms of basic needs, whether it's water provision. And I think in the coming months, and this is like regardless of lockdowns, I think what the government is sort of like is deluding itself is that they can wish away these economic problems simply by opening up the economy, whereas these are, like Aasim pointed out, these are structural, systemic shortcomings that are being sort of revealed because of the pandemic, and they are only going to continue. The economic crisis is also not simply a question of social distancing revealing the crisis. It's a compression of global demand, and it's a compression that is likely to continue into the foreseeable future. And you are going to have the state play a much larger role in ensuring that people's needs are met. So again, I think the balance is really about ensuring that people do behave differently while the state reorients itself in a massive way to change its function from that of a distant sort of a national security state whose fundamental sort of purpose is simply to act as like a patron of various powerful clients in society, to one where it actually actively is working to ensure people's basic needs are met in a crisis which is likely to spiral into global depression in the coming days, where people's actual lives are at risk from a combination of public health and economic reasons.
Right. Thanks, Ammar. Aasim, just on sort of just to conclude the conversation, I think the question that we had for you for this round was in any case, it's linked to what Ammar is also saying, which is that this is a disruption of a scale that we haven't seen for a pretty long time. And as with historical disruptions, we've seen sort of new political and economic arrangements emerge, and some of which have been very progressive in nature. Others have obviously been more reactionary. But when it comes to questions of how the state interacts with obviously this particular disruption and what we see will happen in the future, what are your thoughts on some of the possible outcomes that we might see, not just here in Pakistan, but more globally? And do you think that there are underlying tendencies or reasons for optimism that we might be able to sort of that the world might be able to capitalize on once sort of we move or transition into a time when the pandemic is no longer around?
Well, I mean, yes, I do. I inevitably find some cause for optimism. It's not obvious, it's not apparent, but look at what's happening in the United States. I mean, this is unprecedented, right? I mean, it's not like it's not happened before, anti-racism riots or mobilizations. But there's something, I think, what we have to bear in mind, that all of these things coming together, right? So there's a populist hate-mongering regime, there's a massive pandemic, there's all of these things crystallizing to produce, and then just the fact that every day there's police brutality, but it produces this outcome. I think what we have to be careful about and think very, very deeply about is that this has happened time and again in the last 12 to 15 years. Occupy happened, the Arab Spring happened. We've had a series of very vibrant, incredible mobilizations from below in our country. From the PTM to some, other things that are happening, and these to me suggest that there is an active voice of people that recognize and are able to understand what's going on, are able to name it, and want to do something about it. They're not, as Sameen rightly pointed out, they're not to be decried as some kind of like wackos who are as usual undermining the state. But what I do want to emphasize, I mean, Ammar made this point about populism always sort of not having the capacity or the willingness to understand that you have to come together. What we have to recognize, and this is something that anyone on the progressive side of the political spectrum has to understand and has to contend with, is that there is a lot of polarization. You cannot get around it. You cannot get around the fact that, you were saying, a question you asked just now about like places that the state doesn't have capacity. I disagree with that. The state has capacity. There just has capacity. It operates like a colonial sort of entity that seeks to discipline and conquer. And that is a historical reality we have to contend with, and we have to find idioms where people from the most peripheral zones, that even in a pandemic, are being brutalized. We in Pakistan every day, everyone in the mainstream is able to identify it happening in Kashmir, but we know it happens in our own country as well, right? And I think the real challenge to say is that people who are able to think through these questions and the kinds of mobilizations happening to bring them together. And I think, what's happening in America is a good example, because it says, look, it's police brutality against Black people, but there's a lot of white people who are sort of partaking and calling it what it is. I don't have a suggestion about how, but I will say one thing, and I think this is crucial. I think the people on the progressive side of the political spectrum probably now have to embrace this idea of being the people who call for openness. This is counterintuitive, right? Because for 30 years, because of structural adjustment and globalization, it's always been sort of like viewed as something that is for the mobility of capital, right? For the mobility of money, for profits, for the Panama Papers, and for all of our stashed wealth abroad, right? And I think with these populist regimes that are turning inwards and calling for some kind of like primordial identity, it's some kind of internationalism that harkens to the past, to the heyday of anti-colonial internationalism in the 60s and 70s. These are the sorts of imaginaries that I think all of us at the beginning of the pandemic said, oh, probably a new normal. The window is shutting very quickly. And I think these are the kinds of imaginaries that we have to propagate, right? Internationalism, openness, the fact that we have the technology and capacity now to share medical technologies, to share, everybody claps for Cuba when there's a pandemic because its doctors are willing to go and serve the most oppressed all over the world, but not the systemic logics that produced a Cuba, right? And I think these are the sorts of things that I can't say it's going to happen, but as with everything these days, it's a battle of on sort of digital space and ideology. I think these are the sorts of imaginaries that can be propagated. I think there will be more convulsions because the crisis is so deep. And there will be more reactions. The question is whether that can all be brought together. And I think that, of course, as always, is about will and doing it. It won't just happen because we would like it to be so.
Okay, thank you once again to everyone who was watching, and obviously to our four distinguished panelists who participated. I think it's a fascinating conversation. Just to sort of bring everything together, I think we've had 2 or 3 sort of very interesting strands of thought that we can sort of certainly tie together. The first relate to questions of trust, legitimacy, and capacity, which I think are sort of very immediate requirements that states require when they're trying to confront a disruption as big as a pandemic, which is currently what the Pakistani state is also sort of attempting to deal with, and where its own shortcomings are becoming more and more apparent. But from a more structural perspective, which both Ammar and Aasim have sort of really sort of honed in on, is that these issues are not dislocated from the underlying political bases in which states actually function. And those political bases can be both local, but they're very often linked to sort of global transformations, global systems, systemic logics with the way that, say, for example, capitalism is working, the way that neoliberalism has worked over the past 3 decades. And I think for everyone who is wondering about what sort of the Pakistani state can do, I mean, and the Pakistani state is operating under a number of constraints, many of which are self-imposed and are historical to its own formation and creation and evolution as we understand it. But I think the fact of the matter is, with what Ammar highlighted sort of, and what Sameen actually both highlighted very clearly, is that it requires sort of changing the very orientation towards what the relationship of the state is with the citizens. And we can sort of hope that happens through, on its own, or through some epiphany or realization. But we know that that's not actually how it happens. And what Shandana has earlier said, and what Aasim now sort of has also mentioned, that it really does relate to political incentives, it relates to politics, and it relates to how politics actually takes place. So with that parting note, I again want to thank everyone for tuning in to this webcast. I want to thank the panelists. And do tune into subsequent editions of the LUMS Live webcast. We have a whole host of other interesting seminars planned in the weeks ahead. So till next time, again, everyone, stay safe, stay healthy, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.